where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's live stream about digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm with Kyler Cheatham. We're both from Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stages of digital transformation success. I appreciate you all being here today. What we're doing today is our weekly live stream, which becomes part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So we take this live production, we edit it, we add some additional content, we polish it up, and we make it part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which you can find every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and all the audio podcast platforms. So be sure to check us out or check out that podcast if you haven't already. And thank you for being here today to be part of the production of the podcast with our live Q&A here today. What we want to discuss today, before I introduce our guest, is we're going to take some general questions about digital transformation and technology strategy, just general Q&A. And we've got a few starting points we're going to pull from social media, some engagement we've received in questions we've received, comments, that sort of thing. We're trying to bring to life some of the debates and discussions we've had online and social media, but we also would love to hear from you too. So any questions you have about general digital transformation best practices and or technology strategies, please feel free to drop that in the chat. And speaking of the chat, in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat where you're joining from today too. We'd love to hear what part of the world you're in, what city you're in. We generally draw a global community of people interested in this topic, so we'd love to hear where everyone's joining from today. So all that being said, Kyler, thanks for being here today.
Happy to. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're doing a little bit of a different format here today. Usually when we do these interviews, we typically will have a very targeted topic we're trying to unpack a bit. But we found that occasionally it's nice just to have sort of an open-ended Q&A forum, just to have more of a conversation with the audience, and also trying to pull in some topics from social media as well. And one of the things I wanted to start with, actually, Kyler, was a blog that you recently wrote earlier this month, sort of to coincide with the United States' Independence Day holiday. You wrote a blog called "How Technology Has Changed America," and we published it on July 4th, which is the Day of Independence for the United States, or the day we celebrate our independence in the United States. But maybe, if we sort of broaden the view a little bit here of that topic or that blog, even though the title is "How Technology Changed America," it really applies to the world. I mean, it's how technology has changed the world. That's sort of the way I interpreted the blog. But maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of what got you thinking that would be a good topic, and maybe summarize some of the threads or some of the main points of that blog topic.
Sure, absolutely. So we like to pull in some lifestyle content for not only our US-based audience, but also our global audience. So that's kind of what started the thought process on revolution, right? Because the American Revolution, it was the independence of the United States, or the colonies at the time. So what I wanted to do is just talk about how technology in itself has revolutionized just the way we live our life. So a lot of that has happened through emerging technologies that we utilize in business, right? But also that influences just how we communicate as human beings. So some of those, for example, our artificial intelligence, that has completely revolutionized the way that we do business when it comes to utilizing data and actionable insights from that data and automations. We've seen that in a variety of different industries, whether we're looking at healthcare, telehealth, diagnostics, finance, e-commerce, manufacturing, logistics for supply chain. AI has really come in as a technology that can revolutionize the way those processes are done. And I know we have a big AI focused audience here. So again, we'd love to hear from you wherever you're watching. You can just pop your questions or comments in whatever platform you're utilizing. And that brings us to our next revolution, if you will, which is social media, right? That's the way that we we often communicate. That's the way that we're communicating with our audience right now, through platforms that brings users directly to the brand or the influencer they're talking to, which has never really been a way in which you communicated beforehand. In the business world, that's caused audiences and businesses to have this demand for responding to their communities right away. So you see handles and platforms about customer service, and it's really revolutionized the way that we communicate with our customers, and then also the way that we get analytics about our goods and products. Right, you can get those in real time, make different changes or flexible strategies for your overall digital communities, and it's been a huge change since the before days, if you will, before
Mhm.
social media and everything and that connectivity. So those are just a few things that I wanted to talk about in how that just digital based revolution has brought to the forefront of our human experience, our communication experience, and our business strategies.
Yeah. Yeah, and you actually in the blog too, in addition to the couple things you just mentioned, you sort of get into some um, bleeding edge
Hmm.
technologies, at least in the context of the traditional enterprise and business technology. You talk, for example, about augmented reality
Hmm.
and virtual reality, and I know we've talked a lot in this podcast in the past in past episodes about the metaverse as well. Um, what are your thoughts on just the augmented reality, virtual reality? Do you think that first of all, do you think that's something that is being embraced by the mainstream business community now? And if not, do you think it's something that will be embraced in the near future, or is this something that's sort of pretty far out there that we're still a few years away from really grasping at the enterprise level?
Yeah, I think it's really going to depend a lot. It depends, right? You've taught me well,
Right.
on the business structure. So the metaverse is kind of this unknown, untangible thing, right? We see it kind of in the gaming world, where you can go in and have a completely different digital experience than you have in your physical form, your physical world, if you will. So I'm not sure that metaverse has a solid definition or a relatability, if you will, for how customers will use that in their everyday life. But I think augmented reality and virtual reality are a bit different. There's a different level of comfort in the ease of use. We've seen that through entertainment, specifically sports. We've talked a lot about how augmented reality, virtual reality has really changed the consumption of sports. Whether you are watching through a virtual headset that allows you to see from a seat in a stadium that you've never been able to get that front row access before, or if we're talking about training, specialized training, augmented reality, training surgeons, having the opportunity to actually go through the experience of surgery on a human body in a training capacity that you typically wouldn't be able to do, right? Most people are not just going to, let you open them up and discover all of the different things. I don't think anyone in that capacity really is excited to say, hey, your surgeon has never done surgery before, so they're practicing on you. That could be actually a very vulnerable situation. So being able to hone in on those actual assets and skill sets in an augmented reality or virtual reality sphere is a huge thing for those types of medical healthcare industries, which we kind of talked about before, that digital transformation. So I think there's a lot of different avenues that we're going to have to ease into that if it makes sense for your customer base. I don't know that we're all going to, be having lunch in Japan in the metaverse tomorrow. We'll have to kind of understand what the appetite is for that user base, and understanding your customer and utilizing those analytics through those emerging technologies we just touched on is going to be really the first step to seeing if your business is ready for that on the customer experience side.
Right. Yeah, I was just reading, it was either yesterday or the day before. I was reading an article about how a couple weeks ago, I think it was BMW and Siemens, and maybe a couple other firms had partnered to create an industrial metaverse that's intended to be integrated with technologies like AR and VR with augmented reality, virtual reality, but also pulling in CAD and sort of 3D design and really
Mm-hmm.
trying to help with the product development life cycle and help to speed up the product
Right.
development life cycle and test out products and things like that. I'm not 100% clear on how you mimic human behavior in the metaverse using some of these technologies or accurately mimic human behavior to know how to test the products and that sort of thing. But it sort of leads to a question we actually got from LinkedIn, from Ryan over on LinkedIn. He asks, do you see the technologies you were just talking about, augmented reality, virtual reality, and metaverse, all being different technologies, or do you see them coming together? And just before you answer that, I'll maybe uh, mention the comment of what someone else has already made, sort of a response to that question on LinkedIn. Dakota on LinkedIn already responded to that question and said, "We'll all be the same. That's why Facebook bought Ray-Ban." So I think what Dakota on LinkedIn is suggesting is that these technologies are converging and they're all going to sort of be one universe, if you will, or one ecosystem of technologies. What are your thoughts? I mean, do you like those use cases you just described, like the medical,
Mhm.
the training in the medical field? Do you see that being separate from the metaverse, or do you see this all coming together to where if that were to happen, that sort of training you're talking about in that example, that would need to happen
Yeah.
in the metaverse, or how do you see this all converging, or do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think that the metaverse is an integration of all of these different technologies in the opportunity that it gives you the experience of utilizing them. So very similar to being in a movie theater, right? If you think about consuming entertainment in that way, you see the technology of the actual entertainment, whether it's a movie, the projection technology, the audio technology, even the seats that move sometimes when you're in, a big IMAX setting. Those are all different technologies, technically, right? But they create one cohesive experience. And that's really what the metaverse will be. And when you look at it, or is, depending on who you ask, I don't want to, people sound off in the comments about, if you think it's a real thing yet, but you can see, per Dakota's comment, of bigger brands or organizations setting the foundation for cross pollinating in these different areas. When you look at why Meta, which is now Instagram and Facebook, purchased Ray-Ban, and having that more augmented technology opportunity, those types of different of strategies, to be able to move in that direction through mergers and acquisitions, those types of different pieces. I think to your point that I'll make about the industrial metaverse, it's those efficiencies that you can pull out of product development, of supply chain, suspicious. Whoa. um, Especially, I'll start in a different word. In now our global challenges around supply chain, and if you are able to manufacture using 3D printing, those types of different areas, then you're able to cut and lean out your supply chain areas or breakage points to make your product get to your customers or get to a different business more quickly and efficiently. And that's something that you can pull out today using these technologies, when it comes to specifically, and then moving towards the metaverse and seeing how that emerges for different business and organizations.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating because there's so much left to be determined with metaverse, with AR, with VR, all these technologies we're talking about. There's so much still developing, and it's still maturing at a very rapid pace. It's really hard in some ways to pinpoint or to identify how that technology can fit into a longer term digital strategy for organizations. Um, just a couple comments, as it relates to the metaverse from the audience here. Ryan on LinkedIn says, honestly, I don't see the metaverse catching on for another 3 to 5 years because the technology needed to do all the live stuff they want to do isn't exactly there yet. Microsoft's been working hard to put together mixed reality to where you're viewing real live machines, troubleshooting steps, etc. And he mentions Microsoft, but I think an important point here is that Microsoft is developing their metaverse, Facebook is developing theirs. There's a number of different metaverses being created, sort of like platforms, I guess you could say, metaverse platforms, to where there's not a standard, there's not, there's no universal technology tying this all together, and it's still sort of a lot still TBD or to be determined on what the standard's going to be. Is there going to be which platforms are going to survive or become the sort of the mainstream versions of the metaverse? There's a lot of unknowns there. So I think anyone who adopts it now is going to be, certainly on the bleeding edge of technology, at least in the industrial space. But it's interesting to see Siemens and BMW and some of these other larger firms that are committing to the metaverse and dedicating R&D dollars to try and figure out how to make their businesses better as a result of it. Dakota on LinkedIn also says you need to understand that machines and Meta and your ERP systems all need to talk and act as one. And that's really, I guess, where, I'm still trying to get my head around where the metaverse fits into general or broader enterprise technologies. Because so many organizations are having trouble just getting off their mainframe systems, for example. They're still using systems from the 80s, the green screen mainframe systems. And a lot of those organizations we're helping just to get to some sort of basic level of automation and digitization and digital transformation, whatever you want to call it. That's enough of a struggle for a lot of organizations. And then you add one step further or a couple steps further, which is now introducing the metaverse. And you start talking about like Industry 4.0 and Web 3.0 and some of the big, mega trends in the space. That's a whole nother jump or a whole nother leap beyond what a lot of organizations are struggling with at even more fundamental level. So do you see like change management, which is going to lead me to another social media discussion thread here in a second, but do you see change management being a significant issue or just the human adoption of some of these cutting edge technologies?
Oh, for sure. And I think the culture of the organization around their appetite for change is so important. So what businesses can do today is create that foundation and that acceptance of change, of emerging technologies within their digital strategy. That's going to be step one, is understanding the fundamental shift that this is going to be for your business, not just your customers, but internally. What does that mean for your community? And you're going to need to be able to have a solid change management plan and strategies around what is it going to look like for your employee experience, for your business experience, to be able to transition. Because if you don't have those fundamentals in place, there's no point in integrating any of these new technologies or technology revolutions that we're talking about, because they won't be utilized, or they'll create such disruption in your organization because of misperceptions, because of lack of communication, because of fear, all of those different change management tactics that need to be applied. That's going to be step one in making sure that you're ready to go through any sort of new technology, digital transformation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, one maybe closing comment that'll lead to this next thread that we'll pick up here is Gassan over on LinkedIn says that we're all living in the Matrix. So that's an interesting way to sort of summarize the thread here. And I think that's how a lot of people feel about some of these technologies, is it does feel very Matrix-ish. And by the way, that blog that I mentioned, I should have said this up front, but what's that?
I said, take the red pill, Gassan.
Right. Yep. And the blog that I was referring to here that you wrote, Kyler, How Technology Has Changed America, you can find that on the Third Stage website. I should have said that up front, but I neglected to do that. But thirdstage-consulting.com. is where you find our blog, which we put roughly about 3 blogs a week out on the website. So there's always good stuff there if you ever want to just sort of keep up with some of these emerging trends and some of our thoughts and research and experience with these different technologies. Check out the blog at thirdstage-consulting.com. But one of the other threads I wanted to pick up here, and by the way, to our audience here, let me come back to the audience here before I jump into this question. But if you have questions you want to cover here, just general digital transformation or tech strategy sorts of things, please feel free to drop those in the chat. We love the conversation we're having here so far. We had asked earlier where people are joining from. We have a couple of people from India, from Bangalore, one from Suman, Bangalore. Sam Graham from Spain is here, among others. So those are just a few examples of where people are joining from. I haven't heard anyone say they're joining from the Metaverse, so that's good news, bad news, I suppose. But we are talking about the Metaverse here. But after actually shifting gears away from the Metaverse, maybe just broadening the conversation a little bit to talk about other sorts of stuff, just technology in general. One of the questions that I had asked on LinkedIn, which I love to post just questions for discussion and to get people's feedback on LinkedIn. So if you don't follow or if you're not connected to myself personally and to Third Stage Consulting Group on LinkedIn, be sure to follow us both and connect with us both. We have different threads and conversations going there at any given time. But the question I asked here on LinkedIn, which is of interest, which was just a few days ago, I asked the question of why do people resist change? And then I went on to say, well, despite popular belief, most people simply just don't want to change. And I posted a video, a TikTok video on that post that sort of explained it a little bit more. And so my premise or my argument in this post was that people don't want to change. I mean, in general, and I use intentionally sort of strong language there. I think now that we're unpacking a bit, one thing to clarify is I don't think most people resist change in a nefarious way or in an intentional way. Usually it's more subtle, and it's usually more personal, and it's usually coming from a better place, I would say. I don't think many people within most organizations are just flat out trying to sabotage change or trying to undermine change. I think it's coming from a place of fear and uncertainty and things of that nature. So I was curious to get some feedback from the from the community on that comment. And then so it was interesting because it actually turned into quite a debate, which is oftentimes what I'm trying to do, is stimulate a debate or some controversy. And Eduardo Muniz on LinkedIn, who I'm connected to, made the comment that said, Eric, come on, that's not accurate. If you've ever involved people to deploy change, you should know that people won't perform as expected when facing change, either because they don't understand why change is needed and they don't know how to perform as expected, or simply because they can't. Address those reasons in advance and people will embrace change and make it sustainable. So he has some good points. He's sort of giving an answer here or a prescription to what you need to do to help overcome change. But I guess my point or my hypothesis or my statement was that in general, if you don't do those things, if you just sort of introduce change to an organization, in general, people and organizations are going to resist it, whether you're talking about the metaverse, like we've been talking about here today, or whether you're talking about a financial system or a CRM system or supply chain, whatever, insert technology name or buzzword here, people will generally resist it, especially if it's a bigger change. The bigger the change, the more likely it is that people are going to resist it. But what are some of your thoughts, just based on all the interviews and conversations we've had on this podcast and all of our consulting experience with working with clients and our different team members on project teams? What are some of your thoughts around this whole debate, Kyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think it reminds me of Eric and I both don't like water. It's like if you know the United States, we're both from Colorado, and it's a landlocked state. We don't have a ton of water. So I always think about change management in the fact that people are terrified of the unknown. Like when I go into a big body of water, I'm scared because I have no idea what is under that water. And it makes me uncomfortable. I have no idea what's going to happen to me under that water. I don't know if I can trust what's under that water. I don't know, what the experience will be in the water. And that's a lot of what change management is, right? And the resistance to change is, I don't know this new system. I don't know how it's going to affect my job. Will I have a job? Will I continue to do what I like in my role? What will that look like? And when you have all of those unknowns, or you don't have a solid change management plan, that's where resistance is born. So I would still go more towards your argument, or the argument that you had just mentioned, the fact that it's not so much a resistance that's conscious. It's more of a resistance that's birthed from fear of the unknown, or what's under the water of this new process, experience, or technology.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and that is a good way to relate it back to yours and my personal fears and quirks and that sort of thing. I do have an intense irrational fear of being in the water. Although I love beaches and being around the water, being on the water, I just don't want to get in it. I have no desire to get in any sort of large body of water. So yeah, but it's a good point that you make, and I think getting back to Eduardo's point too, is that he's sort of making the assumption that as long as you do these things, and he mentions that some of the
Mhm.
things that you should do, understanding the why, the how, making sure they have the skills that they need, that sort of is the solution to the problem that I'm describing here. So I think in some ways he's providing a prescription, but he's also validating the point that you need to do these things, or else people are going to resist the change. And I think that's where a lot of organizations fall short, is they assume that people are fed up or tired of their old outdated technologies and
Mhm.
workflows and manual processes. So they, of course, are going to accept technology. They're going to want a new system, or want to make their jobs easier, or whatever the case may be. The problem is everything Eduardo mentions. If they don't understand the how, the
Mhm.
why, what their skills um, are going to be required, what you mentioned as far as are they going to have a job? Those sorts of fears we've got to address, or else people will resist change. And again, it won't generally come from a bad place. It won't generally be super detectable, but it's sort of that underlying current, that back to the water analogy and fear that you and I both have. It's that underlying current that sort of sucks people under when it comes to changing. Um, One of the comments here that maybe will stimulate some additional controversy or comments is from Dakota on LinkedIn. He
Yeah.
says change requires effort and people are lazy. That's why pain is the biggest game changer in humans. So he's just launching grenades here, throwing grenades
I
out at the
love
audience
that.
to respond to.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I love that.
yeah, and I don't know if I'd necessarily use the word lazy. Yes, I mean I think yes, every organization has people that are lazy or underperforming,
Mhm.
whatever you want to call it, and they are going to be even more inclined to resist change. And that's where you're going to see some intentional resistance. Like, I just don't want to
Mhm.
deal with having to change. Or one thing we often see is highly tenured organizations where you have a lot of people
Mhm.
that are coming up on retirement age. They're 2 years
Mhm.
from retirement. The last thing they want to do is deal with some sort of massive overhaul to the way they do their job. They're just trying to, they're trying to get through these last couple of years, so they can hit their retirement. So you do see that. I mean, you are of course going to have that, but I think in general, if you look at 90% or more of most organizations, it's that, yeah, I want to change. In theory, it sounds good. I want to support the organization, but now that you're talking about changing my job, taking away my spreadsheet, jeopardizing my
Mhm.
value, um, reducing the organization's dependency on my personal tribal knowledge, all the stuff I have in my head that makes me
Mhm.
valuable, the heroics I demonstrate by trying to fix problems that are caused by all of our systems. That's the sort of thing that will cause the resistance more often than not. Any thoughts on that? What are your thoughts? Do you think people in general are um, lazy, or just don't want to put in the time and effort to change? Or you started to get into that a little bit in your last response, but what are your thoughts on that comment, Kyler?
Yeah. I think some people are lazy. I don't know that lazy is probably the right term. I would say more like complacent. And I think that's one learning, especially if you are a self-motivated entrepreneurial type of worker, that you look at other colleagues that might be totally okay with their role. And I know for me, I'm always searching for the next sale, right? The next promotion, the next, big project to undergo. And sometimes it can be difficult to look at other people in the organization and say that analyst has been doing what they're doing for the last 20 years, and they have no goals to get to the next level. And you kind of look at that as a negative thing, but that isn't truly a negative thing, right? They could be very happy and content in that role. And so I think taking into account those personalities is important when you look at things like change management. That might not be a laziness, right? But it might be a comfort level in their current role. It reminds me of an organization I was in earlier in my career, which was a Fortune 200 organization, big company. And our physical workspace was going through a renovation, and you would have thought, the world was coming apart because cubicles were moving floors, teams were moving areas. And even something that seems as simple as relocating a department can cause such disruption to people's day-to-day life that it creates an energy of resistance. They don't want to move. They don't want to, go through this transformation, even though it's not a new technology, it's simply moving desks. It can be much more complicated and unnerving to get outside of that comfort or area of influence. So I wouldn't say it's laziness per se, but it is just a comfort in complacency that some people do have that's attached to their overall value within the organization. Whether it is a system or even a physical space can change that. And we saw obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, that huge disruption or unrest when it came to moving to more of a virtual environment, that there was no infrastructure set up in some companies to do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very, very true. And a great point. Um, Sam Graham over on LinkedIn has a great question that sort of broadens this and broadens this conversation about resistance
Mhm.
to change, but also takes it beyond just a change management issue and looking at digital transformation strategies in general. And he asked, to what extent is or should digital transformations be limited by technology, and to what extent should it lead it? So, maybe sort of tying it back to metaverse, any sort of advanced technologies, emerging
Mhm.
technologies, how do you think organizations need to use these technologies to really push them outside of their comfort zone and look to these emerging technologies as ways to define their digital strategy? Or should they, do they need to be constrained and limited by the limitations of technology? Do they look outside of traditional technology options if there are limitations? What are your thoughts on Sam's question here?
Yeah, well, great question, Sam, as always. I think there is a level of curiosity that creates that competitive advantage when looking at new and different technologies. So, in that discovery process, absolutely, if you're a department leader, an executive, those types of things, that's your job, right? To really look out how you're going to expand and grow the business, make a better experience for your employees, your customers, everyone involved. But there also is a level of awareness around your ability to do that. And I think that's the one thing that we see a lot of this conversation coming around with leadership challenges is a lot of times if you are in that executive role, moving into thinking, oh, this is a great new technology, it's going to be amazing, everyone's going to love it. You have to really dig into not only your culture, but also your readiness as an organization to utilize these technologies both internally and externally. So, to answer Sam's question, absolutely. You should always be looking, using, experiencing these new technologies, especially as a leadership role. But if you are looking to integrate it into your overall organization, you have to know if you are ready to do so. It might be the coolest, shiniest, sparkliest, newest technology, in the game. And that's awesome, right? But if your organization is still very manual based, you have to understand that that is a huge transition to take your business through without having some fundamentals in place, to know that you will be successful and then you'll get your return on investment, which is really the point of putting together a new technology digital transformation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It makes total sense. Um, Another interesting comment here from Gassan on LinkedIn is a feasible change catalyst is what's in it for me. How's it going to help me? How's it going to help make my job better? That sort of thing. And in most cases, most people's jobs can be enabled or can be improved by new technology. In some cases they won't be. In some cases they may perceive that their job's actually getting harder because now you're asking them to capture new information in a system or do things in a system that maybe they didn't have to before. But in general, it seems as though there is a what's in it for me for a lot of organizations. Um, Back to this sort of change management thread again, coming back to it here. Chris over on LinkedIn says liberal use of the word automation terrifies people that they will be replaced, and I tend to agree with that. I think that's a word that I kind of wish hadn't come back, or I kind of wish wasn't so commonly used. But the reality is, I guess that is what the technology is doing. In many cases, you are automating manual processes and codifying it in a system and integrating data and that sort of thing. But the perception there is sort of like robotics or robotic process automation. It's sort of a fear-based trigger for a lot of people that see automation as a threat to their jobs. What about with our clients? I mean, what are your thoughts? Or I know you're on the marketing side. You're not generally super close to the consulting engagements, but do you see our clients struggling with that, where people are afraid of automation, they're afraid of losing their jobs, they have that fear? What are some of your observations from our various consulting teams?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually did a recent video for our Third Stage YouTube channel that said stop saying automation. So if I were you, I would just completely take it out of your vocabulary and rename it, rebrand it something within your communication, because that's where these misperceptions lie. And many of you that follow us on TikTok know I got roasted for the Terminator point about automation, because that's really what our knowledge base is. And that's a huge generalization, right? But we have all of these, whether it's media based, whether it's all kinds of different experiences when it comes to robots taking over the world. We use terms like automation, and that might just be what it is. We're automating an email. We're automating, this process so that you can do a better job more efficiently and get the opportunity to learn new skills, to be promoted in your role, to be more successful, so we can give you recognition. So using words, because words do have power, as much as we kind of want to roll our eyes and say, my goodness, you're not going to completely lose your job. It's an automation that comes from a system. It's not that big a deal. Relax. It really does have the power. So using something like an enhancement or a different term when you're talking about this within your communication plan when it comes to a digital transformation, I think is really important.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And you have to, if you do choose to use the word automation, you just have to be aware that that is probably going to trigger some sort of negative response or a fear-based response, which leads back to the previous question or the thread we were talking about as it relates to resistance to change and people generally resisting change. And I think part of it is self-inflicted for organizations. They use these words and they either use words like automation without context, or they just don't give enough detail or context around why we're going through the change, how it affects people, that sort of thing. Organizations get so caught up in the changes themselves, like how to define what the changes are, how to build the system, how to test it, train people on it. They get so myopically focused on just deploying technology that they don't think about, what's the average person experiencing and going through and perceiving as a result of this transformation. So I think that's a big challenge that organizations have to get through as well.
Absolutely.
Just a couple, other comments here, and then we'll shift gears to the next thread. Here's a LinkedIn user. I'm not sure why it's not telling me who it is. This is from Ryan on LinkedIn. It says, I personally think we need to start using the word augmentation. We're augmenting this process so you can focus on those harder to handle tasks. So he's sort of given us a great talking point or a great example of how you can message things differently. And to your point, Kyler, have a better or a more concise use of words to address the fact that people are probably going to resist the change, especially if you just use the word, even the word augmentation. If all you do is use the word augmentation, then that's probably going to stoke fear in people. But if you explain it and unpack what augmentation means and how it benefits and the what's in it for me of people, then that's a different story, and that tends to address the change management issue. It starts to address it. That alone is not enough, but that's a good launching point or springboard into how you can have a change strategy to address some of those fears.
Absolutely.
So,
That's, a great point. I love the augmentation aspect of it, and just understanding that it's important for you to understand what your community thinks that means through those readiness assessments, through those polling tactics. If you think that it means something, make sure that you understand what everybody else thinks it means. And I think no matter what you say, using that data through qualitative and quantitative practices within your organization to understand, okay, what should my communication plan match up with the way that my organization communicates, right? And studying that before you go out and just say things that might mean something different than what your intention is.
right. Yep. I totally agree with that. Um, So, shifting gears a bit, here's another thread from LinkedIn that I wanted to touch on here and bring to life with the audience and with you,
Mhm.
Kyler. And that comment was related, it was another question I posted. And then the conversation on this is still going. So, I imagine by the time this podcast is published, there'll be a lot more conversation that is added on to this online here or on this LinkedIn post. But this question here is, what do you see as the biggest pros and cons of selecting a very targeted niche solution versus a broader ERP system? For example, implementing a CRM system now versus taking longer to implement a full blown CRM system. So I kind of wanted to get the audience or the community's
Mhm.
feedback on, what are the pros and cons of a sort of single ERP or enterprise-wide technology versus more point solutions, more prescriptive or targeted point solutions that you could start deploying that might be able to be deployed faster in more of a sort of an agile mentality or environment, but have limited value in some ways, but also limited risk. How do you compare that, or what are the thoughts of that
Mhm.
versus more of a massive overhaul of enterprise-wide systems, for example, doing an ERP system? So I asked that question on LinkedIn just to get some feedback, and there were a couple comments that came through that were pretty interesting. Um,
Mhm.
one was from Bill on LinkedIn. He said it all depends on the company state to
Mhm.
the company current state to future state roadmap. If the company needs CRM to help support their growth and the full ERP solution includes that CRM or can easily integrate with that CRM, then there's not really an issue. The key is upfront due diligence on all options and choose the best path for today and tomorrow. So, one thing that Bill mentions in his response here is interesting in that, even if you do opt to go with sort of point solutions, in this
Mhm.
example, CRM, you want to deploy a customer relationship management or some sort of Salesforce automation for your sales team, but it's something you're doing in the context of a broader ERP system, or it's one module or a first module within a broader ERP or enterprise wide technology. One thing he's alluding to, though, is the importance of making sure that you have a broader, longer term
Mhm.
strategy and that you're not just going out and picking one technology to sort of put a band aid on one problem within the
Mhm.
organization, but that you just understand what the overall landscape is and how you're going to tie it all together and what the longer term plan is. What are some of your thoughts on that, Kyler?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when you are choosing a best of breed system, you need to treat it as a full ERP system, in the fact that you understand how it will integrate, right? I think that's the key word there. Is a lot of times, my data focused colleagues always teach me that integration is not just flipping a switch. So you have to take that holistic approach, even if you are choosing a more niche system to go within your organization to triage one priority area. You still have to understand, okay, this might be a finance based system or a CRM system, customer relationship management system. How will that affect how the user goes through my point of sale and how I manage that contact there? Will that data match? Because that's going to be the most important part, is still having a data focused strategy that matches in each system, so you can pull out those valuable insights and see the entire digital journey of the customer, of the process, of whatever you're working with. So it's almost like treating it like a full ERP system, so that you can understand which areas of the businesses are going to be influenced by, even if you have a supply chain management system, those types of things.
Right. Yeah. Very, very well put. And I think that broad strategy, or that broad view in the context of a longer term digital strategy, is real important.
Mhm.
And Sam from LinkedIn says, when I've seen companies introduce niche solutions first, I find that those initial choices restrain later choices and options. And I think it just sort of
Mhm.
goes back to the point of, you can go ahead and do those niche solutions, or sort of targeted technologies to solve specific business problems, but you want to make sure that, if you're doing that for your part of the organization, someone else is doing it for their part of the organization, someone else is doing the same exercise for their part. At some point you end up with a spaghetti bowl of spaghetti mess of systems that don't tie together, don't integrate, aren't aligned on a common strategy or platform or whatever. So I think, just having that bigger picture strategy is best. I guess the challenge with that, though, is that sometimes, especially for larger organizations that we work
Mhm.
with, sometimes you just can't get alignment on what that
Mhm.
longer term strategy is, or it takes forever, not forever, but it takes too long to get that alignment. And so in the meantime, you have different pockets of the organization that say, okay, well, while we're trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up over the next few years, we're going to go ahead and deploy a new CRM or an HR system, or
Mhm.
a supply chain set of systems, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's the challenge, and sort of the tightrope you have to walk, especially if you're a larger organization, is, the need to have that long-term strategy and alignment, but also the need to recognize that every month and year that goes by that you're not deploying new technologies, or you're not improving, you're falling behind. So do
Mhm.
you have any suggestions on how organizations might navigate that tension, or that balance that they need to find?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, especially if you are a global, multi-country, humongous organization. That is going to take a very long, it's going to take forever, as you said.
Right.
So I think that alignment, the only way that you're going to get that, especially in that executive tier, is through a data-driven argument, right? By actually showcasing the leadership missed opportunities, missed revenue, efficiencies, how much cost savings will that have? So, really going in with a well researched, well armed proposal is going to, nobody can argue with data, right? Nobody can argue with lost revenue. Obviously, everyone wants to make more money and grow the business. That's going to be the vision. But I think if the more evidence you can collect in that, to put together a full proof argument for the overall project within the business, that's going to be the best method for success. And persistence and patience in an organization that size. We recently were talking to a very large client, and they had been going through just the overall alignment process for 3 to 5 years. So understanding that that does take time, and with each no, you learn the objections you're going to be faced with next time. So if you're like me and you think that that's fun, right? Because you're going to want to win eventually, that executive support, then just continue to do what's best for the business, and understand that every time there might be an objection, that's a reason for you to do more research around the project, to understand, is that actually a valid point, or is that something, that is a misunderstanding within our leadership tier. And I think that that's really the biggest challenge, is siloed leadership, or even celebritized leadership within the organization, this godlike influencer that is on your executive team, that is completely disconnected with the day to day functions of the organization, it can be really hard to bridge that gap, which is why that data, that evidence is so important to bring to that table to get that alignment and get that sign off on a new technology project.
Oh yeah, for sure. And just a couple audience comments to sort of build on what you just said, Kyler. Melissa on LinkedIn says working with the end in mind and on desired outcomes is
Hmm.
key. It's great way to put it. Great, good, very concise summary of sort of
Yeah,
a best practice
well
to
said.
address
Yeah.
this balancing act that we're talking about. Another comment I wanted to pull up here from our chat is a great question here from Chris on LinkedIn. He says, "Is there a
Mhm.
danger that you end up sticking with the short-term solution longer than you should because it ain't broke? I'm dealing with legacy applications that were built 15 years ago but were forgotten." And just sort of addressing that first part of his question, though, whether it's a new technology or even if you're talking
Mhm.
about an older technology that's been in place, in this case, 15 years ago, he's talking about a system that was sort of forgotten about. Um, it's sort of like if you put a band-aid on a problem, it sort of alleviates the pain to where you might just say, yeah, I don't really need to go get that longer term fix or that longer term solution because it's working. We're not bleeding anymore.
Mhm.
We're not at the mercy of really, really limited technology. But on the flip side, we're not taking advantage of what, emerging and evolving and advancing technologies could do for us.
Mhm.
So is that a dynamic that you've seen, or do you think is a challenge for organizations, Kyler, um, as far as just getting to back to your term earlier, complacent?
Mhm.
They become complacent because it's good
Mhm.
enough, whatever it is they have, whether it's a new system or not. And so if I'm complacent, I don't necessarily need to go with the bleeding edge technology because I don't have to. I'm not going to go out
Mhm.
of business. I'm not going to, at least in the short term, I'm not going to be materially detrimented, if that's a word, a verb, by systems. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question because I think you can look at it from a few different ways. And it all comes back to that fundamental assessment of the organization. So if it's not broke, what are your overall priorities as a business? You have to understand that. Are you trying to go into a new marketplace, to a new customer base? Are you trying to create more efficiencies in your manufacturing projects? What are your goals? Because if you do have a system that's functioning, that's not, creating a negative impact, maybe it is okay to learn for a little while. But until you can align on the priorities that you have as an organization, there's going to be no direction, and that's going to be really the most important thing. And to your point, you really do need a CIO, a CDO. I know you talked to Ridwan a few weeks back about what that role is, that has an innovation lens, that is constantly pushing for growth, measuring the marketplace, establishing a digital asset technology advantage within your overall business. And then lastly, what Chris's comment and question made me come back to is really cybersecurity. And that's one of the big things with a lot of these older systems. If they're quote unquote forgotten, right, that can be an open door to some really significant cybersecurity risks. So if you are, a technology executive or a team leader, you need to have a close audit of all of those different systems to understand what is actually one on your menu within systems that you're already utilizing, but also how are you making sure that you're protecting all of these different systems, especially if they haven't been updated, because that's an open door to a lot of hackers, especially in these bigger organizations where a lot of times they do have some sort of legacy system that just hasn't been touched in a really long time.
Yeah, you're sort of touching on a potential solution here of how to break through that complacency, because in some cases
Mhm.
or in many cases, the way I'm interpreting or understanding what you're saying is that maybe we're complacent but we shouldn't be. We think everything's fine, we
Exactly.
think that
Yeah.
the old system or the newer system is good enough, but what you're saying when you talk about cybersecurity or some of the other things you mentioned, maybe things aren't as okay as we think just because we don't see an immediate need for change necessarily. And that's again the role of leaders. and strong leadership within the organization is needed to communicate and articulate what those burning platforms or needs for change are and where they're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just that baseline of awareness too. Is so much of this comes down to having the knowledge of what are your current systems. Are you ready for a new system? What is the competitive advantage in your marketplace? Those types of different pieces. You have to continue to audit the organization, audit the culture, get those data points to make specific and insightful decisions with where you're going to go as a company.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's a really good sort of a capstone or summary of a lot of what we've been talking about here is defining, sort of defining what it is you need as an organization and letting everything else follow behind that. But then once you have decided and defined that longer term strategy, then of course, having a solid change strategy and a way to address the human side of change is so important. Well, good. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about here that we didn't get to, but in the interest of time, we'll wrap up today's conversation. It's already been an hour here, so I want to thank you for your time, Kyler. Thanks for being on the hot seat with me and taking some of these tough questions and controversial topics and unpacking them and bringing them to life here on the show. So thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I always enjoy a good Q&A, and thank you to our audience for always being so interactive. It's such a fun thing for us to learn from you as well. So thank you for all this great insight.
Yeah. Thank you to the audience, and be sure to watch for this podcast or this interview discussion. This Q&A panel will be part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast later this month. You'll find that on every Wednesday. We have new episodes coming out. So it'll either be next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow, or the week after that you'll see this interview in that podcast. So be sure to subscribe to Transformation Ground Control if you don't already. You can find it on LinkedIn and YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as on all the audio podcast platforms too. So thank you to the audience for being here. Thank you, Kyler, for being here. Look for us every Tuesday, same time, same place, same platform. You can find these live streams. And in fact, next week we have an exciting guest. We'll have the CEO of Epicor Software, Lisa Pope, will be on the live stream next week. So be sure to join us then. That'll be a good conversation. We'll talk about the future trends and sort of the technology space in general, where it's headed, and things to be aware of, all that good stuff. So thank you again for being here. I hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you next time on our Tuesday live streams. Have a great week in the meantime.